They say every family has a story it refuses to tell. Some hide it behind smiles, some bury it in attics and land deeds, some lock it in blood. But there are stories so heavy they bend generations, stories that don't just haunt memory, they reshape flesh, silence voices, and stain the future before it's even born. Tonight you're not here by accident. You didn't click this video for comfort. You came because somewhere deep inside, you sensed that American history has rooms that were sealed on purpose, and that one of them is about to be opened. And this family didn't begin as a warning. It began as a solution. A way to survive when the world was hostile, when outsiders meant danger, when trust could get you killed. They lived far from cities, far from law, far from witnesses. Land was cheap, neighbors were distant, and isolation felt like safety. Over time, that isolation hardened into tradition. Outsiders weren't just avoided, they were feared. Marriage became something done within known blood, within familiar names, within the narrow circle that felt controllable. At first, it seemed harmless, practical even. But blood remembers, and blood keeps score, and generation after generation the circle tightened. Cousins married cousins. Uncles whispered promises to nieces. Lines that should have branched outward folded back into themselves. Each birth carried more than hope. It carried echoes, slight differences at first, a learning delay, a child who struggled to speak or stared too long at nothing. These were dismissed as God's will or family traits. In a place where doctors were rare and questions were unwelcome, explanation was dangerous. Silence was safer, and the family learned to protect itself not just from outsiders, but from truth. Children were taught early who they could talk to and who they couldn't. Schools were avoided. Churches were attended but never trusted. Government forms were filled out wrong on purpose. Names were reused so often that records blurred. When someone died young, it was called bad luck. When someone lived but couldn't function, they were hidden. Sheds became bedrooms, bedrooms became cages, and love became something quiet, confused, and often cruel. And by the time the outside world began to notice, the damage was already written into bone. Faces shared the same structure across decades, flattened features, wide, set eyes, jaws that never quite aligned. Hands shook, speech slurred, emotions swung without warning. But what disturbed investigators most wasn't just the physical toll. It was the normalization. Inside the family, this wasn't tragedy. It was routine. This was how things had always been. This was what family looked like. And there are moments in history where survival instincts wrought into something darker. What began as protection turned into control. Elders decided who married whom. Choice was replaced by expectation. Refusal was punished with isolation or shame. Children grew up believing the world beyond their land was evil, perverted, and dangerous, while never realizing the real danger was already inside their bloodline. Trauma didn't just pass down through stories. It passed down through DNA, through nervous systems wired for fear, through bodies that never had a chance to be healthy. And what makes this story unbearable isn't just what happened, it's how long it was allowed to continue. Decades, nearly a century, all while the rest of America told itself that such things only happened in distant countries or in the past. But this was modern, this was quiet, this was legal neglect wrapped in rural invisibility. The family wasn't hiding from the world simply chose not to look. And when the first journalists finally did, they didn't know what to call what they found. A clan, a bloodline, a tragedy without a single villain. There was no mastermind, no dramatic crime scene, just a slow, generational collapse that no one stopped, because stopping it would have meant admitting it existed. The family became a symbol, but symbols strip away humanity. Behind every headline was a child who never learned to read, an adult who never understood consent, a mother who didn't know why her babies kept being born sick. And this is not a story about monsters. It's a story about neglect, fear, and the consequences of isolation taken too far. It's about what happens when survival becomes tradition and tradition becomes a prison. As we move deeper into this archive, you'll hear things that feel uncomfortable, not because they're sensational, but because they're real. And once you see how deep this bloodline runs, you'll understand why some truths aren't buried, they're sealed. And by the time the first official record tried to make sense of this family, it was already too late to trace a clean beginning. Names overlapped, birth dates contradicted each other. Family trees looped back in on themselves like a knot pulled too tight. What should have been branches became circles, and in those circles identity began to dissolve. Children weren't just born into a family, they were born into a system that had quietly erased the idea of an outside world. And the land they lived on wasn't just property. It was a boundary, a psychological wall built from distrust and inherited fear. Roads nearby were used only when absolutely necessary. Visitors were watched. Questions were treated like threats. Generations grew up believing that attention was dangerous, that curiosity invited punishment. So when teachers asked why a child couldn't read, the family stopped sending the child. When doctors suggested testing, the family stopped visiting clinics. The solution to every question was retreat. And inside the home, roles were fixed early. Boys were taught obedience masked as loyalty. Girls were taught silence disguised as duty. Marriage wasn't romance, it was assignment. Elders spoke of keeping things pure, but what they really meant was keeping things familiar. New blood meant new ideas. New ideas meant loss of control. So the family chose stagnation over uncertainty, never realizing that stagnation was poisoning them from the inside out. And as years passed, patterns emerged that no one wanted to name. Children born smaller, milestones missed, tempers that ignited without warning. Some couldn't hold jobs. Some couldn't speak clearly. Others drifted through life with vacant expressions, trapped in bodies shaped by decisions made long before they existed. Yet inside the family, these outcomes weren't questioned. They were absorbed, adapted to, explained away as how we are. And what's chilling is not that the family didn't know something was wrong, but that knowing felt more dangerous than ignorance. To acknowledge the truth would have meant facing guilt, responsibility, and the possibility that love itself had been twisted into harm. So denial became an inheritance. Children learned early not to ask why their cousin looked different, not to wonder why their uncle never married outside the family, not to question why some rooms were locked, or why some relatives were never seen in public. And there were whispers, of course. Even the most sealed systems leak. A neighbor noticed adults who seemed childlike. A shop owner noticed money handled with confusion. A social worker filed a report that went nowhere. Each time the outside world brushed against this family, it pulled back, confused, uncomfortable, unwilling to push harder. Rural privacy laws, lack of resources, and fear of being wrong all played their part. Silence wasn't just chosen by the family. It was enabled by everyone around them. And in that silence, trauma compounded. Abuse, emotional, physical, psychological, didn't announce itself as abuse. It arrived as routine, as discipline. As the way things are done, boundaries blurred. Consent became meaningless in a world where choice was never taught. Victims didn't know they were victims. Perpetrators didn't know they were perpetrators. Everyone was trapped in a system that predated them, performing roles they never agreed to play. And by the fourth and fifth generation, the effects were undeniable to anyone willing to look. Medical professionals later described genetic bottlenecks so severe they were rarely seen outside of laboratory studies. But numbers and terminology fail to capture the human cost. Imagine realizing, too late, that your suffering wasn't random, that it was engineered by decades of fear and control. Imagine understanding that your limitations were not personal failures, but consequences passed down like heirlooms. And yet, even as evidence mounted, intervention remained hesitant. Because this story doesn't fit neatly into narratives of evil. There was no single villain to arrest, no crime scene to photograph, just a slow, motion catastrophe unfolding behind closed doors, protected by distance and indifference. Society prefers monsters with faces. It struggles with monsters made of systems, habits, and neglect. And the family became invisible in plain sight. They existed, but not fully. They were alive, but not allowed to evolve. And every year that passed without interruption deepened the damage. Children born into this bloodline didn't just inherit genes. They inherited silence, confusion, and a distorted understanding of love. By the time help finally arrived, it felt less like rescue and more like excavation. And as we move forward, the question shifts from how this happened to why it was allowed to continue, and what it says about a country that prides itself on freedom, yet looked away while an entire family slowly collapsed under the weight of its own isolation. And there is a moment in every buried story when the truth stops being abstract and starts having a pulse. For this family, that moment came not through confession but through observation. Outsiders didn't arrive with accusations. They arrived with clipboards, cautious language, and eyes that lingered too long. What they saw didn't fit into paperwork. It didn't fit into training manuals. It felt older than law and quieter than crime, and adults spoke like children. Children carried the exhaustion of people twice their age. Conversations looped. Simple questions caused panic. Some family members laughed at inappropriate moments, not out of cruelty but confusion. Others avoided eye contact entirely, as if the act of being seen triggered something buried deep in their nervous systems. This wasn't just intellectual disability. It was generational trauma wearing a human face, and what no one outside fully understood was that the family's isolation wasn't just geographic, it was psychological conditioning. From birth, children were taught that the world beyond their land was hostile, corrupt, and predatory. Teachers were portrayed as liars, doctors as threats, government as something that takes children away. Fear was the family's most consistent inheritance. And fear, when repeated long enough, becomes belief. And inside the household, affection existed, but it was tangled. Love was expressed through control. Protection came through confinement. The idea of independence was framed as betrayal. If a child showed curiosity, it was discouraged. If they asked about life beyond the family, they were reminded of dangers waiting outside. Over time, curiosity dimmed. Compliance replaced wonder, and the cycle reinforced itself. And when geneticists later tried to map the bloodline, they described it as one of the most severe cases of inbreeding documented outside closed religious sects or royal dynasties. But unlike royal families, there were no historians preserving context, no doctors monitoring health, no institutions quietly correcting course. This family was alone, and isolation, when combined with unchecked reproduction, doesn't just damage bodies. It warps reality itself. And imagine growing up never knowing that your experience is abnormal, never realizing that other families don't live like this, never understanding why tasks others find simple feel impossible to you. Shame grows quietly in those conditions. Not loud shame, but heavy shame, the kind that makes you shrink inward, avoid questions, and accept pain as normal. Many in the family didn't know what was wrong with them. They only knew they were different, and that difference made the world dangerous. And then there's the cruelest layer of all: blame. Some family members blamed themselves for their limitations. Others blamed relatives, some blamed God, but rarely did blame land where it belonged. On a system that valued control over health, familiarity over humanity, it's easier to accept personal failure than to confront generational guilt. Easier to believe you were born broken than to admit you were broken by design. And when intervention finally came, it wasn't cinematic. No dramatic rescues. It came slowly, awkwardly, and painfully late. Evaluations, interviews, files thick with notes no one wanted to write. The family's reaction wasn't anger, it was confusion. Why now? Why us? Why are you here? To them, this life was normal. The horror outsiders felt wasn't shared inside the bloodline. And that disconnect may be the most disturbing detail of all. And because when harm becomes routine, it stops feeling like harm. And when suffering is all you've ever known, relief feels suspicious. Some family members resisted help not because they enjoyed their condition, but because change threatened the only structure they understood. Freedom is terrifying when you've never been taught how to use it, and the story doesn't offer easy villains or clean resolutions. No single decision caused this. It was death by 1,000 quiet choices. A marriage here, a silence there, a report ignored, a road not taken. And with each generation the cost increased, until the family itself became evidence of what happens when fear is allowed to guide bloodlines. And as you listen, you may feel the urge to distance yourself, to think, this could never happen now, not here, not anymore. But history doesn't need darkness to repeat itself, it only needs neglect. And as we go deeper, you'll see that this family's story isn't just about who they were, it's about who we chose not to protect. And what the public eventually saw were fragments, short clips, blurred faces, headlines stripped of context. But fragments lie. They simplify what was never simple. Inside this family, damage didn't arrive all at once. It accumulated, slowly, quietly, like rust eating through a structure everyone assumes is still standing. And children were born into roles before they were born into names. Expectations were inherited like eye color. You would stay, you would marry within, you would obey. And if you couldn't understand why, that only made you easier to control. Intelligence gaps weren't just tolerated, they were convenient. Dependence kept the system intact, independence threatened it. And for many of them, time itself felt different. Days blurred together without milestones. No graduations, no career paths, no sense of forward motion. Life was cyclical, repetitive, and small. Wake up, eat, work if you can, sit if you can't, sleep, repeat. The world beyond the property existed only as rumor, and rumors were dangerous things. They made people curious. Curiosity led to questions, and questions led to consequences. And the family developed its own internal logic, rules that made no sense to outsiders but governed everything inside. Certain relatives were obeyed without explanation. Certain topics were never discussed. Certain behaviors were excused because that's just how he is, or she can't help it. Over time, responsibility dissolved. When no one is accountable, harm floats freely, landing wherever it can, and one of the most unsettling aspects uncovered later was how normalized suffering had become. Pain wasn't dramatic, it wasn't screamed, it was accepted. A child who struggled was simply slow. An adult who lashed out was moody. A pregnancy between close relatives wasn't scandal, it was routine. When you remove language for harm, harm becomes invisible, and outsiders often ask why no one left. It's a question that sounds logical from a distance, but it misunderstands how captivity works. Leaving requires awareness. It requires a sense that something else is possible. This family was denied both. Imagine being raised in a world where your limitations are never explained, only enforced. Where your confusion is treated as proof that you need supervision, not education. Where fear is dressed up as love, and even when some family members express discomfort, they lack the tools to articulate it. Trauma doesn't always look like screaming or rebellion. Sometimes it looks like compliance, like passivity, like a quiet acceptance that this is all there is, that you are all there is. And then there is the weight of blood, guilt, the unspoken knowledge that something is wrong, mixed with the terror of admitting your own role in it. Older generations carried shame they didn't know how to name. Younger generations inherited the consequences without understanding the cause. The result was a family emotionally frozen in time, unable to move forward, unable to look back. And when the media finally arrived in force, it brought exposure, but not understanding. Cameras don't heal. Attention doesn't undo decades of neglect. If anything, sudden visibility added another layer of trauma. Faces that had been hidden were now scrutinized. Lives that had been ignored were now consumed as content. The family became a spectacle, a cautionary tale, a viral curiosity. And once again, their humanity was overshadowed, this time by the public's fascination, and some viewers felt pity, others felt disgust, few felt responsibility. It's easier to point at a family and call them broken than to ask why systems designed to protect children failed so completely. Why isolation was allowed to override intervention. Why warnings were ignored. Why suffering had to reach this level before it was acknowledged. And the truth is uncomfortable. This story didn't require secrecy to survive. It required indifference. It required the belief that it's not our business. It required distance, physical, emotional, moral. And distance is something America has always had plenty of when the suffering happens far from cities and far from power. And what remains now are lives shaped by decisions they never made. Some family members were eventually relocated, evaluated, given limited support. But you cannot rewind a nervous system. You cannot undo developmental damage. You cannot give someone a childhood after it's gone. At best, you can offer safety, and safety arriving late feels fragile. And as we move closer to the core of this story, the question shifts again. Not just how this family survived like this, but what it reveals about the stories we choose to confront and the ones we quietly step around. Because this bloodline didn't collapse in darkness. It collapsed in plain sight. And there's a point in every investigation where the focus stops being the family and starts being the mirror it holds up to everyone watching. By now, you may feel a tightening in your chest, not from shock, but recognition. Not recognition of the details, but of the mechanism. Because this story isn't just about isolation. It's about what happens when people decide that looking away is easier than intervening. And authorities who reviewed the case later admitted something unsettling. The warning signs were there long before the story ever reached the public. Reports were filed, concerns were raised, notes were taken. But each time, the response was hesitant. Rural jurisdiction confusion, limited resources, fear of overreach, fear of being wrong, fear of backlash. And in that hesitation, generations continued to be born into a system that had already failed them. And the family was treated as an anomaly, something strange but contained. As long as they didn't cause public disruption, they were left alone. This is the quiet bargain society often makes with suffering. If it stays out of sight, it can be tolerated. But suffering doesn't need an audience to be real. It only needs time. And what haunts many professionals involved is not what they found, but what they almost missed. The realization that had intervention come earlier, even a decade earlier, the trajectory could have changed. Fewer births into the cycle, more education, medical monitoring, boundaries, choice. Instead, the family aged in place, accumulating damage like sediment. By the time help arrived, it wasn't prevention, it was damage control. And some members, once separated from the environment, showed small but profound changes. Anxiety lessened, communication improved, simple skills were learned late in life. These moments were bittersweet, proof that capacity existed, but had been suppressed. That potential had been there all along, buried under fear and conditioning. And with that proof came grief. Grief for what might have been, and others struggled deeply with the transition. Freedom, when introduced without preparation, can feel like abandonment. Structure, even harmful structure, can feel safer than uncertainty. Some long to return, not because the past was kind, but because it was familiar. Trauma bonds are powerful. They don't break simply because the outside world labels them unhealthy. And the public reaction followed a predictable arc. Initial horror, then fascination, then fatigue. Stories like this trend, peak and disappear. But for the people living inside them, there is no closing tab, no turning it off. Their lives don't resolve when the documentary ends. They continue, quietly, imperfectly, and often alone. And this is where the discomfort should settle in. Because it's easy to frame this family as the most inbred, as an extreme, as something distant from normal life. Labels create distance. They make it easier to believe this could never happen again. But the truth is more unsettling. Systems that allow neglect, isolation, and unchecked control still exist. They just wear different faces. And if you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? And that question isn't hypothetical. It's a test. Would you have stayed silent to protect family reputation? Would you have trusted tradition over evidence? Would you have looked away because involvement felt uncomfortable? Or would you have risked being the villain in someone else's story to stop the damage from continuing? And history is shaped less by monsters and more by ordinary people making small decisions. Decisions to speak or not speak, to act or delay, to believe or dismiss. This family's story wasn't sealed by one horrific choice. It was sealed by thousands of quiet ones. And as time passes, the bloodline will fade, names will change. Some branches will end, others will continue, altered by intervention and time. But the lesson remains, waiting for the next place where isolation masquerades as privacy, where fear masquerades as protection, and where silence masquerades as peace. And you may leave this video unsettled. That's the point. Comfort is the enemy of vigilance. Stories like this aren't meant to be consumed and forgotten. They're meant to linger, to disturb, to remind us that the darkest chapters of history aren't always written in blood and fire, but in neglect, paperwork, and the collective decision not to look too closely. And because the most dangerous secrets aren't buried deep underground, they're the ones everyone knows are there and chooses to walk around. And what lingers after the files are closed and the cameras are gone is not outrage, but residue. The kind that settles quietly into memory and refuses to leave. For the family members who survived into intervention, life did not suddenly become whole. It became fragmented in a different way. New rules replaced old ones. New faces replaced familiar fear. And for the first time, many were asked questions they had never been allowed to ask themselves. And who are you really? What do you want? What hurts? And these are simple questions for most people. For them, they were destabilizing. Identity had never been personal. It was inherited. Assigned. To ask someone who had lived their entire life under instruction to suddenly decide for themselves was not liberation. It was vertigo. Some responded with silence, others with anxiety, a few with anger that had no clear target, and therapists described a pattern that repeated again and again. Family members would make progress, then regress. Trust would form, then collapse. Not because help was unwanted, but because help contradicted everything they had been taught. In their world, care came with control. Attention came with consequences. So when kindness arrived without strings, it felt like a trap. And there is a specific grief that comes from learning the truth too late. Not the dramatic grief of loss, but the slow, burning kind. The realization that your life could have been different. That the struggles you blamed on yourself were never your fault. That the shame you carried belonged to a system that failed you. This grief doesn't scream. It weighs, and some family members never fully processed this. Their minds, already shaped by genetic and environmental damage, lacked the tools to integrate such revelations. Others understood just enough for it to hurt. Awareness without agency is its own form of suffering, knowing what was taken from you without having the means to reclaim it. And then there are the children born after intervention, the ones who represent a fragile break in the cycle. They carry hope, but also a burden, the weight of being, the ones who got out, the silent comparison to those who didn't, the expectation to be proof that change works. Even healing, it turns out, comes with pressure, and for society, the story slowly dissolved into myth, retold inaccurately, exaggerated, simplified into shock value. The phrase, most inbred, became a label detached from lives. It turned a complex human tragedy into a headline designed to provoke reaction, not reflection, and in doing so, it repeated a familiar harm, reducing people to their worst circumstances. And what's lost in that reduction is accountability. Not of the family, but of the systems that failed to intervene when intervention mattered most, of the cultural obsession with privacy that shields abuse, of the romanticization of isolation, of the belief that suffering behind closed doors is less urgent than suffering that disrupts public order. And this story forces an uncomfortable truth into the open. Neglect can be generational. It can be inherited not through blood, but through policy indifference and fear of complexity. It thrives in the spaces where no one wants to take responsibility, where everyone assumes someone else will step in. And maybe that's why this story unsettles so deeply. Because it doesn't allow for clean moral distance. It doesn't let us point and say them without also asking us. The family did not exist in a vacuum. They existed within a country that values freedom, yet often mistakes non-interference for respect. And as the years pass, the physical signs of this bloodline will fade. Records will be archived, faces will age, some names will disappear entirely, but the conditions that allowed it to happen remain possible. They wait quietly, in other isolated places, in other closed systems, in other families convinced that secrecy equals safety. And the final question this story leaves us with isn't about genetics. It's about courage. The courage to look where it's uncomfortable, to intervene before tragedy becomes tradition, to understand that privacy should never be a shield for harm, and that silence when it protects suffering is never neutral. And because history doesn't repeat itself the same way, it repeats itself where it's ignored, and there is no clean ending to a story like this. No closing chapter that restores balance or redeems the past. What remains is a quiet aftermath, a landscape altered so deeply that even when the storm has passed, the ground is no longer the same. The bloodline that once folded in on itself is thinning now, not by design but by consequence. Some branches end without ceremony. Others continue, cautiously, under watchful systems that arrived far too late. And what history will remember is uncertain. Records reduce lives to data. Diagnoses replace names. Future readers may scan the details and feel a momentary chill before moving on. But memory, when stripped of emotion, loses its warning. And this story is a warning, not about genetics alone, but about what happens when fear is allowed to masquerade as tradition. And the family did not wake up one day and choose destruction. They chose safety, familiarity, control. They chose what felt survivable in the moment, without seeing how survival instincts can rot when they're never challenged. Generation by generation, those choices hardened into rules, and rules, when left unquestioned, become cages. And this is the part most people resist hearing. There was no single moment where everything went wrong. There was no obvious line to cross. Just a series of small decisions, each one defensible on its own, that accumulated into irreversible harm. That's how history works when no one interrupts it. Catastrophe doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it whispers, politely, until it's too late to stop listening. And you may want to distance yourself from this story. To tell yourself it belongs to a different time, a different place, a different kind of people. But distance is a comfort we earn by forgetting, and forgetting is how the conditions for repetition are created. Isolation still exists, closed systems still exist, families still hide pain behind loyalty, institutions still hesitate when intervention feels complicated. And what this story demands is not horror but vigilance. The understanding that darkness doesn't always look violent. Sometimes it looks quiet, rural, private. Sometimes it looks like people being left alone when they shouldn't be. Sometimes it looks like silence mistaken for peace. And if there is any meaning to extract from what happened, it's this: blood does not determine destiny, but silence can. Secrets don't just stay hidden, they shape the future. And when those secrets are passed down instead of confronted, they don't fade, they deepen. And somewhere, right now, there are stories still sealed. Not because they're unknown, but because they're inconvenient. This family's history only surfaced because the damage became impossible to ignore. The question is how many others will be allowed to reach that point before anyone decides to look closer. And you didn't enter this story as a witness to spectacle. You entered it as a witness to consequence. And once witnessed, responsibility changes shape. You may forget details, faces, names. But if this story has done its job, you won't forget the feeling, the quiet dread that comes from realizing how easily harm can grow when no one intervenes. And history doesn't need villains to repeat itself. It only needs patience. And then patience, when paired with silence, is how tragedies learn to last.